Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 8, Emotion and Motivation, Part 5, Achievement, Hunger, and More. So, achievement can be motivated by a desire for recognition, fame, praise, money, or other extrinsic incentives. There is an intrinsic satisfaction that comes from meeting a challenge and attaining a goal of personal significance. And measuring that need for achievement, we have used some different types of tools here. There is what we call the TAD, or the thematic apperception test. Kind of looks a little bit like this, where you would be given an image, and you are to kind of tell the story about what you see. This was developed by Henry Murray and David McClellan to measure achievement motivation. So a person who's looking at this individual or these individuals, if we come up with a storyline that is talking about something that is a little bit positive versus maybe something negative, is somebody working together as a team, or are we looking at individual efforts? That might kind of give us an idea of maybe where somebody's need for achievement might lay. So this need for achievement, this is a mental state that produces a psychological motive to excel or to reach some goal. And people with a high need for achievement, that's what the NACH stands for, might see a picture of a boy happily progressing on his violin, maybe showing pleasure or joy, um, maybe getting better grades, higher IQ, choosing a competitive job, assuming some kind of leadership role, maybe earning some kind of promotion. That's all kind of positive. People that might have a lower need of achievement might see the boy as holding someone else's violin, wishing he could play it, struggling with some issues, maybe having some self-pity. All of that could be revealed by just looking at a ambiguous picture and kind of describing it. So, cross-cultural perspectives on achievement. Cultures do differ in how they value the place of achievement motivation. When we talk about individualistic cultures, this is kind of the Euro-American kind of view. It's the view that places a higher value on individual achievement and distinctions and such, versus the collectivism view or collective view, which is found in places like Latin America, parts of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, that values the group loyalty and pride over individual distinction. All right, let's talk about hunger motivation. Hunger does serve as a part of our biological maintenance and survival mechanisms. The brain uses a multiple approach to hunger. We receive information from our body's energy requirements, our nutritional state, food preferences, food cues in our environment, and our cultural demands. And we have the set point. This is the tendency for the body to maintain a certain level of body fat and body weight. The signals, for the most part, of our set points trigger our eating behavior, and it is kind of a homeostatic process. When we talk about eating disorders, bulimia nervosis, this is characterized by periods of binge eating, followed by purging methods that would include things like vomiting, fasting, laxatives. It is 10 times more common in females, especially females who are adolescent or young adults. Not to say that it doesn't happen in men, but women have a higher tendency of this. Anorexia nervosis is an emotional disorder characterized by a lack or a loss of appetite. The person weighs less than 85% of their desirable weight. So if you're using a body like a BMI or a body mass index, they would be kind of on that lower half of that. Uh, they worry about being fat. There's a certain level of hyperactivity opposed to lethargy, which you might see with bulimics. In America, obesity has grown at an alarming rate since the early 80s. As a result of that, 30% of our population is classified as being obese. Causes of obesity are things such as a lack of exercise, poor diet, and other genetic factors. Uh, we have a tendency to eat more food when it is abundant, and a third of Americans do happen to say that at some given point in time they are on a diet. Thirst and pain. Thirst, for the most part, directs activity that moves us towards substances that will satisfy that thirst. The thirst drive, not dive, takes two forms. You got volumetric thirst. This is the drop of extracellular fluid levels, such as a drop in the level of plasma levels in our blood. And then you can have the osmotic thirst, which is the drop in the intercellular fluid levels. This results from water moving through the cell walls of our body and escaping in the form of sweat, urine, feces, mucus, and the moisture in our breath. All right, we're going to talk about sexual motivation. And this is kind of a little bit of a kind of a sensitive topic as we go along here. So, a certain amount of discretion is advised here. But we're going to talk about a few researchers here, and we're going to start with Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana, and during the time between the 1940s and 1950s, he did a little bit of research on sexual behavior of people. He interviewed some 17,000 individuals, and from these interviews, he found out a lot of information about human sexual behavior, especially since there hadn't really been a lot of data on that. It actually was released in a couple different volumes of work. As a matter of fact, even though the books that kind of came out of this research were by far merely scientific, very research orientated, they were bestsellers on the New York Times bestsellers list. I think people were reading them thinking they were going to read about something other than data. But nevertheless, we learned a lot about the behaviors of humans in regards to their sexual behavior. What they might have said was not necessarily always what they did. And in the 1960s, we had two other researchers, William Masters and Virginia Johnson, who were with the University of St. Louis, if I remember correctly. They studied, kind of took Kinsey's work a step further, and they studied sex by directly observing and recording the physiological patterns of people engaging in sexual activities. This was incredibly controversial, by the way. Needless to say, one of the things that they did discover was the sexual response cycle, which includes basically the four-stage sequence of arousal, plateau, should be orgasm, not organism, and resolution. And then for the most part, this kind of give us a better idea of maybe how, when it comes to sexual response, how men and women do vary. They also use some of the research to develop behavioral theories for a variety of sexual disorders as well. Sexual cues and sexual scripts. When we talk about sexual cues, the big thing to remember is that when we talk about sexual attraction and such like that, the human brain is probably a huge factor when we talk about what we consider to be desirable as far as person's looks and behaviors and such. And that kind of helps us develop these sexual scripts. This is the socially learned ways of responding to sexual situations. And for the most part, they do vary a little bit according to gender. For the most part, while scripts kind of suggest certain images and goals, they provide kind of unreliable and unrealistic information. And research supports the idea that men and women frequently perceive sexual related behaviors very differently. So a man might look at a woman, and a woman might perceive that as meaning one thing opposed to maybe what the man is referring to. And that can be very confusing by all means. And I'm sure that there could be a lot more research on that alone, and maybe that would help us with problems that we're facing in society today when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual assaults and things of that nature. Anyway, there is an evolutionary perspective on sexuality. This perspective looks for the origin of sexual motivation in our genes, the goal of both sexes to leave as many offsprings as possible. And for females, this involves caution in selecting a mate. For males, this might involve copulating as often as possible with as many people as possible. And hence, when we look at that primitive perspective, that might explain, maybe animalistic behaviors, but it also kind of gives us a general idea of maybe where we have come as far as the development of humans. All right, motives in conflict. When we talk about motives in conflict, this is getting into talking about how we approach certain issues. And this is not necessarily a sexual kind of thing, but we can talk about it maybe for conflicts that we all face in our lives. The approach conflict, this is a conflict in which one must choose between two equally attractive options. I like to call it the win-win perspective. So you win either way. Whatever you choose, you're going to come out ahead. You can also get into the approach avoidance perspective. This is a conflict in which there are both appealing and negative aspects to any decision that has to be made. So there may be some good things and bad things. Are you at Skylar? Okay, I will be coming to SCOTUS then. All right, bye. All right. There is also the avoidance conflict. This is a conflict in which one has to choose between two equally unattractive options. And finally, the multiple approach avoidance, meaning that you have one must choose between options that have both many attractive and many negative aspects. When we talk about the origins of sexual orientation, this is one's attraction towards members of the same sex, such as homosexuality, or the opposite sex when we talk about heterosexuality, or for both sexes when we talk about bisexuality. Some of this is information that obviously became a little bit more clear when we talk about the research of Alfred Kinsey. But your book talks a little bit about sometimes culture can dictate some of these things. And if you read about New Guinea and some of the issues that they have with homosexual and heterosexual behaviors in young men, it gets kind of complicated. Thank you very much.